The smoke alarm woke me at 2:47 in the morning. I remember the exact time because I looked at it twice, once when I opened my eyes and thought I was dreaming, and once 30 seconds later when I realized the ceiling above my bed had turned the color of a sunset that shouldn't exist indoors. My name is Naomi Ashford. I'm 31 years old. I've been a hospice nurse for 8 years, which means I have spent the better part of a decade sitting with dying people while their families argued in hallways about wills, about who visited more, about who deserved the antique clock. I thought I understood how ugly families could get near an ending. I did not yet understand how ugly mine could get near mine. The fire moved fast. Faster than the movies make it look. By the time I got my downstairs neighbor, Mrs. Petrosky, out of her apartment and onto the sidewalk in my bare feet, the whole east side of the building was lit up like something out of a war footage clip, orange licking out of the windows, glass popping somewhere above us like distant gunfire. Someone was screaming. I realized after a moment it was me screaming Mrs. Petrosky's cat's name, because she wouldn't stop crying about the cat, and I went back up 2 flights of stairs into a wall of gray smoke, because 8 years of hospice work has taught me that some fights you don't get to sit out. I found the cat. I don't fully remember how. I remember the heat pressing on my face like a hand, and I remember thinking, with a strange, detached clarity, I hope this makes a good story if I don't make it out of here. The kind of thought you have when your brain is trying to protect you from the thought underneath it. I made it out. The cat made it out. My apartment did not. By 4 in the morning, I was sitting on the curb across the street, wrapped in a blanket a paramedic had put over my shoulders, watching the building I had lived in for 6 years fold in on itself floor by floor. Everything I owned. My grandmother's quilt. The photo albums from before everything went digital. My nursing certifications, the physical copies, framed on the wall by my desk. Gone, or being actively eaten by fire while I sat there in soot-streaked pajamas holding a stranger's cat. That was when I called my mother. I want to be honest about what I expected. I did not expect warmth, exactly. I'd stopped expecting that from my mother sometime around my 23rd birthday, the one she forgot because she was so busy helping my younger sister Callie plan a birthday party for Callie's boyfriend's dog. I expected competence, at least. I expected the version of my mother that shows up for logistics even when she can't show up for feelings. Send money for a hotel. Make a call. Show up with a coat. What I got was 3 rings, a groggy hello, and then, once I got the words out, the building's on fire, Mom, everything's gone, I need somewhere to stay tonight, a long pause, followed by, Naomi, honey, it's almost 5 in the morning. I know. I'm sorry. I didn't know who else to call. Another pause. I could hear my father's voice in the background, muffled, asking who it was. It's Naomi, my mother said, away from the phone, in the exact tone she used to use when I was a teenager and had done something she considered an inconvenience rather than a crisis. Then, back to me, is anyone hurt? No. I got everyone out. But Mom, I don't have anywhere. Well, that's good, that no one's hurt. A beat. You really should get renter's insurance, you know. I told you that when you moved in. This is exactly why. I sat there on the curb with a stranger's cat clawing gently at my blanket, watching the fire department fight a losing battle against my whole life, and I said, I do have renter's insurance, Mom. That's not, I just need somewhere to sleep tonight. A couch. Anything. It's just, your father has that early meeting and Callie's staying in the guest room this week because of the thing with her lease. You know how that's been, and honestly, Naomi, I don't know what you want me to say. Fires happen. You'll figure it out. You always do. You always do, for words that had been the answer to every crisis in my adult life. You always do. When I paid for my own nursing school because they said Callie's cosmetology certification was a better investment of family resources. You always do. When I drove myself to the ER after a car accident because everyone was busy and called an Uber home afterward with a concussion. You always do. When I sat alone in a hospice room holding a stranger's hand because his own children hadn't spoken to him in a decade, and then drove myself home and cried in my car because there was no one to call who would ask how my day was. This isn't the same as figuring it out, Mom. I have nothing. My car's fine, but everything else. Not our problem, sweetheart. She said it lightly, like she was declining a party invitation, not her daughter sitting on a curb at 5 in the morning with smoke in her lungs. You're a grown woman. I'm sure the Red Cross does something for this kind of thing. Look, I have to go, your father's stirring. Glad you're okay. Text me when you find somewhere. The line went dead before I could say anything else. I sat there for a long moment, the phone still against my ear, listening to a dial tone that felt like it was underlining every conversation I'd had with my mother for the last decade. A firefighter walked past me with an axe over his shoulder, soot black, exhausted, and he glanced at me with more visible concern in 3 seconds than my mother had shown in the entire phone call. I want to tell you, I cried. I didn't, not then. Something in me had gone very still and very cold, the way it does sometimes at a deathbed, when the only useful thing left to do is observe clearly and not fall apart, because falling apart helps no one. I called my coworker, Denise, instead. She picked up on the second ring, heard 4 words, "My building's on fire," and said, "I'm coming to get you, don't move," and 40 minutes later she was there in her pajama pants and a coat thrown over them, wrapping me in a hug that smelled like her house, like safety. Like the opposite of the last phone call I'd had. That night, on Denise's couch, wrapped in a blanket that wasn't mine, I started a note on my phone. I didn't plan for it to become what it became. I just needed somewhere to put things down, because that's what I do, I document. 8 years of charting vitals and medication times and the small, specific details that matter when someone's life is on the line has made it a reflex. I wrote down the time I called my mother. I wrote down what she said, as close to word for word as I could remember. I wrote down that Callie was in the guest room because of the lease thing, which struck me, even in my exhausted state, as odd, because as far as I knew, Callie's lease didn't end for another 4 months. I didn't know yet that this note would become the spine of everything that followed. I just knew that something about that phone call, about the specific coldness of "not our problem," sat wrong in my chest in a way that went beyond ordinary parental disappointment. It felt like guilt wearing indifference as a disguise. I didn't have the language for that feeling yet. I would, soon enough. The fire marshal's name was Deputy Investigator Raymond Cho, and he found me 3 days later at Denise's apartment, where I was still sleeping on the pull-out couch, wearing clothes Denise's cousin had dropped off because they were roughly my size. He was a tired-looking man in his 50s with kind eyes and the specific patience of someone who has delivered bad news for a living long enough to have developed a gentle, careful way of doing it. He sat across from me at Denise's kitchen table with a folder and a cup of coffee he didn't touch. "Ms. Ashford, I want to start by saying I'm very glad you're safe," he said. "I also want to be straightforward with you, because I think you'd rather have that than a soft version. Our investigation has determined that the fire did not start accidentally." I remember my hands going cold around my own coffee mug. "What does that mean?" I said. Not really a question. I already knew, in the way you know something before you're ready to know it. It means the point of origin was your unit specifically, not a neighboring unit, not a shared electrical system, not the building's wiring, which, frankly, given the building's age, was our first assumption. It started in your kitchen, near the back door that leads out to the fire escape. We found accelerant residue. This was set. The room went very quiet. Somewhere in Denise's apartment, her dog's nails clicked against the hardwood, oblivious. "Someone set my apartment on fire," I said, slowly, the words feeling foreign in my mouth even as I said them. "That's our determination, yes. I have to ask you some questions now, and I want you to take your time. Who had a key to your apartment?" I sat there running through the list in my head, the way you do when a stranger's life depends on precision, except this time the stranger was me. "My landlord. My upstairs neighbor has a spare, for emergencies, we trade, she waters my plants when I travel. Denise, who I'm staying with now. And my family. My parents have a key. My sister has a key." "Your sister," he said, and something in the way he said it, neutral but attentive, made me look up. "When's the last time she was at your apartment?" "I don't know. A few weeks ago, maybe?" She came by to borrow. I stopped. I hadn't thought about this in 3 days, hadn't had room to think about anything except finding a place to sleep and calling my insurance company and trying not to fall apart at work, where I still had patients who needed me steady. She came by to borrow some of my late grandmother's jewelry. For a photo shoot. She said she'd bring it back. Investigator Cho wrote something down. Did she? I don't know. It would have burned with everything else, so I never checked. Why does it matter? He looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look I recognized from years of delivering hard news myself, the look of someone deciding how much truth a person can absorb at once. We found something at the scene, he said finally. Near the point of origin, mostly intact, fire tends to preserve small metal objects even when it destroys almost everything around them. It's a ring. Gold with a small sapphire engraved on the inside band. Do you know if that could belong to you or someone in your family? My stomach dropped somewhere around my knees. That's my grandmother's ring, I said. It has her initials engraved inside. Ime. Eleanor Marie Ashford. She left it to me specifically in her will 3 years ago. It was one of the only things of hers I had left after she passed. Callie was supposed to be borrowing the whole set of jewelry for a shoot, including that ring, and bringing it all back. Ms. Ashford, he said, gently, the ring was found roughly 4 feet from where we believe the fire was deliberately started. Not in your jewelry box, which was found melted but closed, in your bedroom, on the opposite side of the apartment. The ring was on the kitchen floor, near the back door. Can you think of a reason your grandmother's ring would be in your kitchen, near a point of deliberate ignition, rather than in your jewelry box where you say you kept it? I couldn't. I sat there with my mouth slightly open, trying to construct an innocent explanation, and I couldn't find one, because I already kept meticulous track of where things lived in my apartment, another hospice habit. Another symptom of a life spent needing to know exactly where the morphine was, exactly what time the last dose was given, exactly which drawer held the paperwork a grieving family would need. I did not misplace things. I did not leave my dead grandmother's ring on the kitchen floor. I don't have an explanation for that, I said quietly. That's all right, Investigator Cho said. That's what the investigation is for. I have to ask you something else now, and I need you to answer honestly, even if it's uncomfortable. Is there anyone in your life, family, an ex-partner, a coworker, anyone who might benefit from this fire? Financially or otherwise? I thought about my mother's voice on the phone. Not our problem. I thought about Callie borrowing the jewelry a few weeks before the fire, jewelry that was supposed to be mine, jewelry that connected me to the one person in my family who had ever made me feel like I mattered without conditions attached. And then I thought about the will. I need to back up here, because you won't understand what happened next without understanding what came before, the actual architecture of my family, the load-bearing walls of favoritism and resentment that had been under construction since before I could walk. My grandmother, Eleanor Ashford, was my father's mother. She lived 4 blocks from my childhood home for most of my life, and she was, without exaggeration, the only adult in my early life who made me feel like my presence in a room was a good thing rather than an inconvenience to be managed. My mother never liked her. I understood some of why. Later, Eleanor was blunt in a way that read as harsh if you weren't used to it, and she never pretended to like people she didn't like, which my mother, a woman who has built her entire identity around being liked, found intolerable. But more than that, I think my mother resented that Eleanor saw through her. Saw the favoritism toward Callie. Saw the way I got quietly deprioritized over and over in 100 small decisions that never individually looked like cruelty, but that added up, over 18 years, into something that absolutely was. You're the strong one, my mother used to say to me, usually right after doing something that required me to be strong because she wasn't going to step up. When I was 12 and had to walk myself home from a canceled soccer practice because she'd forgotten to pick me up, again, because Callie had a dance recital. When I was 16 and drove myself to get my wisdom teeth out because both my parents were at Callie's cheerleading competition. You're so independent, Naomi. You don't need us hovering. Callie's more sensitive. She needs more support. I know now, I knew even then. somewhere underneath the part of me that desperately wanted to believe I was being complimented, that "you're the strong one" is very often just "we've decided you don't count," dressed up in a compliment so it goes down easier. It's a magic trick. It turns neglect into a virtue you're supposed to be grateful for. Eleanor never did that to me. Eleanor showed up. She was at my nursing school graduation in the front row, cheering loud enough to embarrass me, while my parents sent a card because they'd committed to a golf trip they'd booked before they knew the graduation date, a fact I only found out later was not actually true. Callie had told me, years afterward, half apologetic and half oblivious to what she was admitting, that the golf trip had actually been booked after they knew the date, because Mom said your graduation would probably be boring. Anyway, it's just nursing school, not like a real ceremony. When Eleanor died 3 years ago, a stroke, quick, at home, the way she would have wanted it if she'd been consulted, she left a will that split her estate in a way that made my mother furious for reasons that took me a long time to fully piece together. The house went to my father, her son, which was expected. The bulk of her savings was split between my father and my aunt, Eleanor's other child. But there was a smaller trust, not enormous, but not nothing, somewhere around $80,000, that Eleanor had specifically earmarked for me. Not for Callie. Not split between us. For me, in recognition, the will read, in Eleanor's own carefully dictated language, of Naomi's character, her chosen profession of caring for others, and her consistent presence in my life when it mattered. The jewelry, including the sapphire ring, was also left specifically to me. My mother did not take this well. I remember the reading of the will, in a lawyer's office that smelled like old carpet and coffee, my mother's face going through several expressions in quick succession before settling on a tight, bright smile that I recognized as the one she used at parties when she was furious, but couldn't show it. Callie cried, actually cried, right there in the lawyer's office, and said, "I don't understand. Grandma always said she loved us both the same." And my mother put an arm around her and glared at me over Callie's shoulder like I had personally engineered my grandmother's stroke for financial gain. The trust was structured with a 5-year vesting period. Eleanor's lawyer explained it was a common structure for younger beneficiaries, meant to prevent the money from being spent all at once. Or, in Eleanor's blunter private words to me months before she died, meant to make sure your mother can't talk you into handing it over to Callie the second I'm in the ground. I hadn't understood at the time how prophetic that sentence would turn out to be. 3 years had passed. The trust had 2 years left before it fully vested and became mine to access freely. Until then, I received a modest quarterly distribution, enough to help with rent, not enough to touch the principal, which sat in an account that, per the trust's terms, would revert to Callie and my mother in equal shares if I died before the vesting date was reached, a fairly standard contingency clause that Eleanor's lawyer had included as boilerplate, the kind of clause nobody thinks matters until suddenly it might. I want to be very clear that I did not think about this clause on the night of the fire, or even in the days immediately after. Grief and shock don't leave room for financial architecture. It was investigator Cho, methodical and careful, who asked the question that made me think about it for the first time. Do you have any financial arrangements, a will, a trust, an insurance policy, where your death or incapacitation would benefit a specific person? I told him about the trust. I watched his face change, very slightly, the professional stillness of a man recalibrating a theory in real time. "Ms. Ashford," he said, "I think we need to talk about your sister. Here is where I earn the reputation this story has apparently gotten among people who've heard it, the reputation for being someone who doesn't just take a hit and move on. I want to say plainly, I didn't set out to be a detective. I set out to survive a fire, and then to survive my family's reaction to that fire, and it was only in trying to survive both of those things that I started noticing patterns I might otherwise have let slide. The habit that saved me is a hospice nursing habit, and it's not glamorous. It's charting. It's the practice, drilled into you from your first week of clinical rotations, of writing down what actually happened, in specific, time-stamped, unemotional language. Because someday a family member or a lawyer or a medical examiner is going to need the truth, and your memory alone will not be good enough. You learn to distrust your own recollection under stress. You learn to write things down immediately, while they're fresh, because grief and shock rewrite memory in real time to make it more bearable, and more bearable is not the same as accurate. So when I sat on Denise's couch the night of the fire and started that note on my phone, I wasn't building a case. I was doing what I do every single shift of my working life, creating a contemporaneous record because some part of my brain, even in crisis, refused to let a moment pass undocumented. Over the following 2 weeks, as investigator Cho's team dug deeper, that habit became the thing that let me see what I might otherwise have missed, or worse, might have talked myself out of seeing. The way I'd spent 31 years talking myself out of seeing the shape of my own family. I went back through my phone. Texts with Callie from the 6 weeks before the fire. She'd texted me about borrowing the jewelry set for a shoot that, when I later checked with the photographer whose name she'd mentioned in passing, had actually happened 3 weeks earlier and had not, according to the photographer, involved any jewelry at all. She'd asked, in a separate text 10 days before the fire, what time I usually left for my overnight shifts, just curious, a question that had seemed unremarkable at the time and now sat in my chest like a stone. She'd asked, for days before the fire, if I still kept a spare key under the fake rock by Mrs. Petrosky's door, a detail I'd mentioned to her once, months earlier, in an unrelated conversation about my downstairs neighbor, a detail I'd genuinely forgotten I'd ever shared until I scrolled back and saw it in her own words. Texted back to me as a question, do you still leave that spare under Petrosky's rock? LOL, so paranoid. I hadn't thought anything of it at the time. Why would I? Callie asks a lot of questions. She always has. It's part of what made her easy to love as a kid sister and exhausting to be related to as an adult, an endless, restless curiosity about other people's lives that never quite extended to actually caring what happened to them once she had the information. I gave investigator Cho copies of the texts. I gave him the note I'd started the night of the fire. I gave him, at his request, a full account of the trust, the will, the vesting date, the reversion clause. He was scrupulously professional throughout, careful never to let me see him draw conclusions before the evidence supported them, but I could tell, by the third meeting, that his theory had solidified into something close to certainty, even if he wasn't going to say so out loud until forensics and financials caught up to what the texts already suggested. We're pulling security footage from a gas station 2 blocks from your building, he told me, in our third meeting, and financial records for a few individuals with your permission and appropriate warrants. I want to caution you, these things take time, and I don't want to promise you an outcome before I have one. But I want you to know we're taking this seriously, and I want you to keep doing exactly what you've been doing. That documentation you gave me, the texts, the timeline, that's some of the most useful material I've seen from a victim in a case like this. Most people don't think to keep records like that. It's going to matter. I went home to Denise's that night. Home was a strange word to use for a pull-out couch, but it was the only home I had, and I sat with the strange, cold clarity that had first arrived on the curb the night of the fire. My sister had asked about my spare key location. My sister had borrowed my grandmother's jewelry, including a ring found 4 feet from where the fire was deliberately started, a ring that should have been safely tucked in her handbag or her own jewelry box, not on my kitchen floor. My sister stood to inherit half of an $80,000 trust if I had died in that fire. And my mother, who I had called at 5 a.m. with my life in ashes, had told me Callie was staying in the guest room, because of the lease thing, for months before Callie's actual lease was due to end. I didn't know yet exactly what that detail meant. But I wrote it down anyway, in the note on my phone, under a heading I'd started calling, with a bitterness I didn't try to hide from myself, things my mother said that don't add up. It took another 11 days for the full picture to come together, and I want to walk through how it did, because the way the truth arrived was almost as important as the truth itself. Investigator Cho's team pulled the gas station footage. It showed a young woman, hood up, buying a single red gas can and paying in cash, for days before the fire. The footage was grainy, the face obscured by the hoodie, not immediately conclusive, but the car in the background of the frame, parked at the pump, was a pale blue Honda Civic with a very distinctive rear bumper sticker, a faded pink flamingo, that I recognized instantly because I'd made fun of Callie for buying it 2 summers ago. That alone wasn't enough for an arrest. Cho was careful to tell me that, and I respected him for it. He wasn't going to let a bumper sticker convict someone, and neither was I. But it was enough for a warrant, and the warrant on Callie's financial records turned up something that even I, with all my carefully accumulated suspicion, hadn't anticipated. Callie was in debt. Not the ordinary kind of debt a 28-year-old carries: credit cards, a car loan. She was in debt to a person, an individual lender, to the tune of nearly $12,000. Money she'd apparently borrowed 8 months earlier from a man investigator Cho's team identified through her call records as someone with a documented history of aggressive, occasionally violent debt collection practices, currently under separate investigation by a different unit entirely. Callie had borrowed the money, it turned out, to cover a business venture, a clothing boutique she'd opened 18 months earlier that had failed within a year, leaving her holding a lease she couldn't cover and a supplier she owed thousands to. She needed money. Fast, and in a way that wouldn't require explaining the debt to our parents, who I later learned had already bailed her out of 2 previous financial messes and had, according to a conversation investigator Cho's team obtained through a subpoenaed voicemail Callie had left our mother, a voicemail Callie apparently didn't realize was still saved to my mother's old phone, which was seized as part of a broader records request, told her explicitly that they would not be covering a third mistake. "I can't ask them again, Mom. You know what they said last time," Callie's voice said on that recording, tight and panicked. "I need to figure something else out. I have like 3 weeks before this guy stops being nice about it." The voicemail was left 6 weeks before the fire. And here is the detail that broke something open in me, the detail that investigator Cho showed me with visible reluctance, warning me before he did that it might be hard to hear. In that same voicemail, Callie mentioned, almost in passing, something about Naomi's trust thing, asking our mother, half joking, half serious, whether it was true that the trust goes to us if something happens to her before it vests, or does that only apply if she doesn't have a will of her own. I can't remember what the lawyer said. My mother had known. My mother had known, weeks before the fire, that Callie was in serious financial trouble, in debt to a dangerous person, and had, in that same window of time, discussed with Callie, however casually, however deniable, the mechanics of what would happen to my trust if I died. I don't know, even now, exactly how much my mother knew or suspected about what Callie eventually did. I want to be careful here, the way investigator Cho was careful, because there's a difference between knowing your daughter is desperate and dangerous and knowing your daughter is planning arson, and I genuinely don't know which one my mother was guilty of. What I do know is that 4 days before the fire, my mother made a hotel-adjacent arrangement in her own house, clearing out the guest room, for months before Callie's actual lease ended, ostensibly because of the lease thing that put Callie under her own roof, with an alibi on the specific dates surrounding the fire. I don't think my mother lit that match. I think, if I'm honest and fair in the way Eleanor raised me to try to be even about people who don't deserve it, my mother built a soft place for her favorite daughter to land regardless of what that daughter had done. The way she'd been building soft places for Callie to land her entire life, without ever once asking the hard question of what, exactly, she was cushioning her from. That, to me, ended up being almost worse than if she'd known everything outright. She didn't need to know the details. She'd spent 30 years training herself not to ask. Callie was arrested on a Tuesday morning in the driveway of our parents' house on charges of arson in the first degree and attempted murder because investigator Cho's team had determined, through the burn pattern and the timing, that the fire had been set at an hour when the arsonist would reasonably have expected me to be home and asleep, given my known schedule, information Callie had specifically fished for in that text about my overnight shifts. I wasn't there when it happened. I found out from investigator Cho, who called me himself rather than letting me hear it secondhand, which I've never forgotten, and which taught me something about the difference between people who do their jobs and people who do their jobs with actual decency. "I wanted you to hear it from me before it hits the news," he said. "Your sister's in custody." I know this isn't going to feel like the relief people expect it to feel like. It rarely does, in cases like this. He was right. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt like someone had reached into my chest and rearranged everything I understood about my own family, and I was going to need time to figure out what the new shape even was. My mother called me that evening. Her first call to me since the 5 a.m. conversation on the curb, 5 weeks earlier. I almost didn't answer. I want to be honest about that. Some part of me, the part still made of 31 years of wanting her approval, almost picked up out of pure reflex, the muscle memory of a daughter conditioned to be available whenever her mother finally deigned to reach out. I let it ring out instead. Then I texted her a single line, asterisk, if you have something to say it here. I'm not doing a phone call, asterisk. She called back twice more. I let both go to voicemail. Then she texted, a wall of text that took up my whole screen, and I'm going to reproduce the shape of it here, if not the exact words, because it tells you everything about who my mother actually is underneath 30 years of careful presentation. She said Callie made a terrible mistake, but that Callie was not a monster, that Callie was desperate and scared and made one bad decision, that I needed to think about what kind of person I wanted to be. Did I want to be the kind of sister who sent her own blood to prison? Or did I want to show some grace? Because family is family, and this family has already been through enough. She did not, anywhere in that message, apologize for telling me not our problem while my apartment burned. She did not apologize for the guest room, for the lease lie, for a lifetime of small, cumulative choices that had taught Callie, with total consistency, that consequences were things that happened to Naomi and not to her. She asked me to think about what kind of person I wanted to be. She never once asked what kind of person she had been. I did not respond to that message for 3 days. When I did, I sent something shorter than what she'd sent me, because I'd spent those 3 days writing and deleting drafts until I found the version that was true without being cruel, a distinction I'd learned to value. Watching families at bedside say things in anger they could never take back. Asterisk, I already know what kind of person I want to be, Mom. I want to be the kind of person who tells the truth even when it's inconvenient for other people. You've spent my whole life asking me to be the strong one so you wouldn't have to be anything at all. I'm not doing that anymore. I hope Callie gets whatever help she actually needs, in prison or out of it. I'm not going to lie for her or for you to make that easier. If you want a relationship with me going forward, it starts with you telling the truth about what you knew and when, to the investigators and to me. Not before, asterisk. She never did tell the truth about what she knew, not fully, not in any way I've ever been able to verify. I don't think she ever will. Some people build their entire identity around never having to look directly at the thing they've done, and my mother has had 30 years of practice looking away from anything inconvenient. I stopped expecting her to develop that particular skill at 58 years old, in the middle of a criminal case, just because it would have been narratively satisfying for her to do so. I want to pause the story here and talk directly about the thing that I think matters most in it, because in the retelling, and I know this story has been retold, passed around, turned into the kind of thing people share in the comment sections of other people's stories, the dramatic parts tend to get all the attention. The fire. The ring. The arrest. The confrontation. But the actual hinge of everything that happened, the thing that turned me from a victim who got told not our problem into someone whose own family member is now facing decades in prison, was not a dramatic confrontation. It was a habit. It was months and years of training myself, in a completely unrelated context, to write things down clearly and immediately and without emotional editing, because that's what my job demanded of me. I think about this a lot now, in the context of hospice work specifically. Part of what I do, part of what I did even in the weeks surrounding all of this, sitting with dying patients on my shifts between meetings with investigators and lawyers, is help families understand that the story they're about to tell themselves about a death, about who visited, who cared, who showed up, is going to calcify very quickly into the official family narrative, whether or not it's accurate. Grief moves fast to protect itself. It reaches for the version of events that hurts least, and it holds onto that version so tightly that within a year, sometimes within a month, entire families will swear to a sequence of events that never actually happened, because the true sequence was too painful to carry. I think my mother had already been doing that, quietly, for years, long before the fire, rewriting the story of my childhood into one where I was the strong one by nature rather than by necessity, where Callie was the sensitive one, rather than the favored one, where every unequal thing that happened between us was a reflection of our characters rather than a reflection of her choices. And I think, in the days after the fire, she tried to do it again, in real time, at incredible speed, tried to make not our problem into a footnote, tried to make Callie's arson into one bad decision from a scared kid rather than a calculated act with a financial motive months in the making. What stopped her from succeeding this time wasn't confrontation. It was the plain, boring, unglamorous fact that I had a time-stamped record of what she actually said, and investigator Cho had a subpoenaed voicemail of what Callie actually asked, and a gas station camera had actually captured what Callie actually bought. For days before my home burned down around a ring that was never supposed to be on my kitchen floor. Documentation doesn't feel like power in the moment you're doing it. It feels like a coping mechanism, a small compulsive habit, a way of managing chaos by imposing order on it after the fact. But it is power. It is, I've come to believe, one of the only forms of power available to people who've spent their whole lives being told their version of events doesn't matter as much as everyone else's. When you can't trust anyone to believe you, you can at least make sure the record believes you. If there's a piece of advice buried in this story that I'd actually want someone to walk away with, it's that one. Write it down. Whatever it is. The phone call where someone tells you it's not their problem. The text where something doesn't add up. The moment where a story someone tells you doesn't match the story they told you last month. You don't have to act on it right away. You don't have to build a case. Just write it down, clearly, with a date and time in your own words, while it's fresh. You may never need it. But if you ever do, you'll be glad it exists, because your memory alone, under the pressure of grief or shock or a family determined to gaslight you into smallness, will not be reliable enough to save you. The record will be. There was a second reading, months later, not of a will this time, but of something almost as consequential, the formal outcome of Callie's case, delivered in a courtroom that felt very far removed from the lawyer's office where Eleanor's will had first been read 3 years earlier, though I couldn't stop drawing the comparison in my head as I sat there. Callie eventually took a plea deal, arson in the second degree, reduced from first, with an admission that removed the attempted murder charge in exchange for a guilty plea and cooperation with a separate investigation into the man she owed money to, whose collection practices were, it turned out, considerably darker than aggressive debt collection alone, involving at least 2 other victims willing to testify once Callie's case cracked the investigation open. She received a sentence of 6 years, with the possibility of parole after 4, and a restitution order requiring her to repay the cost of my destroyed apartment and possessions, an order I have very little faith will ever be meaningfully fulfilled, given that she has no assets and a felony record that will make steady employment difficult for years. I sat in that courtroom between Denise and investigator Cho, who came even though his job with the case had technically ended, because he told me quietly before the proceedings started, some of these you want to see through to the end, if the person at the center of it will let you. My parents sat on the other side of the room. My mother did not look at me once, not the whole time. My father, who had said almost nothing throughout the entire process, a silence I've come to understand as its own kind of answer, caught my eye once, briefly, and looked away, and I don't know, even now, if that look contained shame or simply exhaustion. I've stopped trying to extract meaning from my father's silences. He offers so few of anything else that I don't think there's enough material there to interpret. Callie, when it was her turn to speak before sentencing, cried. She apologized to me directly, by name, said she never meant for anyone to get hurt, said she panicked and made the worst decision of my life, and that she thought about calling it off so many times, but the debt kept growing and she didn't know what else to do. I believe some of that. I believe she was scared. I believe, Even that some small part of her hoped I wouldn't be home, hoped this could be a victimless crime against an insurance policy rather than a crime against a sister. Though the text asking about my overnight shift schedule complicates that belief considerably, and I've made my peace with not fully resolving that complication, because I don't think Callie has fully resolved it either, and probably never fully will. What I don't believe, and have stopped trying to force myself to believe out of some misplaced sense of family loyalty, is that this was purely a story about one desperate person's bad decision, disconnected from everything around it. Callie didn't grow up believing consequences didn't apply to her by accident. She grew up in a house that taught her that, consistently, for 28 years, through 1,000 small choices that always protected her and always cost me. I was the strong one. She was the sensitive one. I paid my own way through nursing school. Her failed boutique got bailed out twice before the third time, when the bailout finally required actual honesty about the scale of the problem. Honesty she couldn't offer because honesty had never once been required of her before. I don't say this to excuse what she did. Nothing excuses it. She made a choice, an adult, criminal, dangerous choice, and she is the only person who lit that match, and she is the only person serving that sentence, as she should be. But I've spent enough years now sitting with dying people and their families to know that almost nobody arrives at a catastrophic choice in a vacuum. The vacuum is a comfortable story families tell themselves afterward, so they don't have to look at the 30 years of context that built the conditions for the catastrophe. My mother would very much like this to be a story about one bad daughter and one good daughter, a story with a clean villain and a clean hero, because that story requires nothing further of her. I don't think she's going to get that story, not from me, not anymore. Here is what I did, in the months that followed. And I offer it not as a template. Every family is different. Every fracture requires its own specific repair or its own specific ending, but as an honest account of what actually happened. Because I think the honest, unglamorous account is more useful than a tidy moral. I did not cut my father off entirely. We text occasionally. He sent flowers when I moved into my new apartment, 6 months after the fire, a small one-bedroom on the other side of the city, paid for partly by insurance and partly by the trust, which fully vested 2 months ago and which I have started, cautiously, to think of as what Eleanor intended it to be, not blood money, not a monument to family dysfunction, but a door out, built by the one person in my family who saw clearly enough, years in advance, to build me an exit before I even knew I'd need one. I did cut my mother off, functionally, though I haven't announced it as dramatically as that sentence makes it sound. I don't return her calls. I respond to occasional texts with short, factual replies, the way you'd respond to a coworker you're required to remain professionally civil with, but owe nothing further to. She has, as far as I know, never once said the words, "I'm sorry" to me, not about the phone call, not about the guest room, not about 30 years of small erasures that built the conditions for a fire. I stopped waiting for those words sometime around the 6-month mark, not because I decided I didn't deserve them, but because I finally accepted that waiting for them was its own kind of self-harm, a way of keeping a wound open in the hope that the person who caused it might eventually decide to close it, when she had shown me, with total consistency, across 3 decades, that closing my wounds had simply never been a priority of hers. I did not speak to Callie again before her sentencing, and I have not visited her since. I don't know if that will change over the 6 years, or 4 of her sentence. I think it might, eventually, in some limited form. She is still my sister, and there is a version of the future where enough time and enough genuine accountability on her part might allow for something smaller and more careful than what we had before. But I am not going to perform forgiveness on a timeline that serves my mother's comfort rather than my own healing, and I am not going to pretend that family is a complete moral argument when it has, in my family's specific case, functioned mostly as a phrase used to demand my compliance while asking nothing of anyone else. I went back to work 3 weeks after the fire, earlier than Denise thought was wise, probably earlier than it was wise, but hospice work, oddly, was the thing that kept me steady rather than the thing that broke me further. There is something clarifying about sitting with people in the last days of their lives, Watching what they actually care about when everything performative has burned away. No pun intended, and it is never, in my 8 years of doing this, been about who inherited what or who kept up the right appearances. It is always about whether the people who claim to love them actually showed up. Sat in the chair. Held the hand. Told the truth. I have a patient right now, an 81-year-old man named Walter, whose daughter drives 4 hours every single weekend to sit with him, even though he doesn't always remember her name anymore. I think about my mother, who lived 4 blocks from her own mother-in-law for years and rarely visited, and I think about this daughter, driving 4 hours for a man who might not recognize her face by the time she arrives, and I think that's the whole difference, right there, between the people worth building a life around and the people who are just occupying space in your family tree. Showing up is the whole test. Everyone fails it eventually, in small ways. I failed it myself. We all have. But there's a difference between failing it occasionally, under real strain, and building an entire relational strategy around never having to take it. People ask me, when they hear this story, and by now enough people have heard some version of it that I've had to get comfortable telling it in shorter and shorter forms, at dinners, at work, in the strange way that trauma eventually becomes a story you tell rather than a thing you're still bleeding from. What I kept, in the end, from the fire. Physically, I mean. What survived? The honest answer is almost nothing. The quilt didn't make it. The photo albums didn't make it. Most of my furniture, my clothes, 8 years of nursing school notes I'd kept for sentimental reasons, my grandmother's letters, all of it gone, reduced to the kind of ash that firefighters have to hose down for hours before it stops smoldering. The ring survived. That's the strange, bitter irony at the center of all of this. The one object that survived the fire almost intact was the one object that proved the fire had been set on purpose, by the one person who was supposed to love me. Investigator Cho's office returned it to me, eventually, after the case concluded, in a small manila envelope, the gold slightly discolored from heat, the sapphire somehow undamaged. I wear it now most days. Not because I've made some tidy peace with what it represents. I haven't, not fully, and I don't know if I ever will, but because it was Eleanor's, first and always, before it became evidence, before it became the physical proof of my sister's desperation. And I refuse to let what Callie did with it erase what it meant before that. What I kept, beyond the ring, is harder to put into a sentence, but I've had a lot of therapy in the past year, and my therapist helped me find the words for it eventually. I kept the version of myself that documents things. I kept the version of myself that noticed, even in shock and grief, that something didn't add up, and trusted that instinct instead of talking myself out of it the way I'd been trained to do for 31 years. I kept the capacity to say, not our problem, back to the people who'd said it to me first, not out of cruelty, but out of the simple, long overdue recognition that I am allowed to have boundaries with people who have never once had them with me. And I kept the understanding, hard-won and expensive in every sense of that word, that strong is not a compliment when it's used as a substitute for someone we don't have to take care of. I spent 31 years accepting that substitution because the alternative, admitting that my own mother simply prioritized my comfort less than my sister's, was too painful to sit with directly. It took an actual fire, an actual arson charge, an actual courtroom, to finally make that substitution impossible to keep accepting. I don't know how to end a story like this cleanly, because it isn't over. Callie has years left in prison. My mother is still out there constructing whatever version of these events lets her sleep at night, and I am still, some days, a person putting a life back together out of insurance paperwork and secondhand furniture and a new apartment that doesn't yet feel entirely like mine. But I know this. The next time someone tells me a crisis of mine is not their problem, I am not going to spend the following 5 weeks quietly documenting evidence of my own worth before I believe I'm allowed to act on it. I already know I'm allowed. The fire, in its own devastating way, is what finally taught me that, not because it destroyed my apartment, but because it destroyed the very last of my illusions about which of my family members had ever actually been on my side. Eleanor knew. She built me a door 2 years before I needed it. I like to think, wherever she is, that she isn't surprised by any of this. Not the fire, not Callie, not my mother's silence. I like to think she's mostly just glad the ring made it back to the right hand. Nobody warns you about the paperwork. That's the part one want to add here, because in the retelling, in the version of this story that gets passed around, the paperwork always disappears into a montage, a few sentences about insurance and moving on, and the actual months of it get erased. I spent more hours on hold with my renter's insurance company than I spent in every meeting with investigator Cho combined. I spent an entire Saturday photographing water-damaged, smoke-damaged fragments of my old life that the fire department allowed me to retrieve from the wreckage, cataloging them for a claims adjuster who spoke to me in the exact clipped, professionally sympathetic tone I recognize from my own job, the tone you use when you've delivered this particular kind of bad news so many times that empathy has become a procedure rather than a feeling. I want to talk about that. Actually, about how strange it was to be on the receiving end of professional sympathy for months, after a lifetime of being the one who provides it. Hospice work trains you to read a room instantly, who needs silence, who needs information, who needs someone to just sit there and not perform anything at all. I found myself doing that instinctively with my own claims adjuster, with the victim's advocate assigned to Callie's case, with the trauma counselor Denise practically frog-marched me into seeing, reading their faces, managing their comfort, making sure they didn't have to work too hard to take care of me. It took my therapist pointing this out directly, in maybe our 4th session, for me to even notice I was doing it. "You keep checking in on whether I'm okay with what you're telling me," she said. "You did it 3 times in the last 10 minutes. I hadn't realized. That's the insidious part of being raised as the strong one. You don't just learn to not need things, you learn to actively manage the emotional experience of the people around your need, so that even your grief comes wrapped in consideration for someone else's comfort. I am still unlearning that. I don't know if you ever fully unlearn it. But I've gotten better at catching myself mid-sentence, mid-apology, mid-instinct to smooth things over for someone else's benefit, and just letting the sentence be uncomfortable instead. Letting the silence sit there without me rushing to fill it with reassurance nobody asked me for. The insurance eventually paid out, though not as much as replacing an entire life actually costs. Nobody warns you that renters' insurance valuations are built around depreciated value, so your 6-year-old couch is worth, on paper, a fraction of what a new one costs, and multiply that gap across every single object you owned, and you start to understand why so many fire survivors end up quietly, invisibly poor for years afterward. Long after the news cameras and the sympathy casseroles have stopped. I am still, 14 months later, replacing things. Small things. A cast iron pan I finally got around to buying 2 months ago, because my old one, seasoned over 6 years, was simply gone, and there is no insurance claim in the world that replaces 6 years of seasoning on a pan, or 6 years of anything, really. I haven't mentioned my aunt yet, and I want to correct that, because she became one of the more unexpected parts of this story. My Aunt Rosalind is Eleanor's daughter, my father's sister, my mother's sister-in-law, a woman I'd always liked well enough at holidays, but had never been particularly close to. Mostly because she'd moved across the country for work when I was in my early 20s, and our contact had thinned to the occasional holiday card and a birthday text. She and my mother had never gotten along, for reasons that, in hindsight, probably trace back to the exact same clear-eyed skepticism about favoritism that made Eleanor so unwelcome at my mother's dinner table. Rosalind called me 2 days after the arson determination became public within the family, before Callie's arrest, in that strange limbo period when I knew and investigator Cho's team knew, but the wider family circle didn't yet. I don't know how she'd heard. I suspect my father, in one of his rare moments of doing something rather than nothing, had called her, but she called me directly, without preamble, and said, "I'm not going to pretend I'm shocked." I've watched that family dynamic for 30 years, and I always thought something like this was going to happen eventually. I just assumed it'd be Callie driving drunk into something, not this. "Do you have somewhere safe to stay? Do you need money? I mean it, don't be polite about it." It was such a small thing, in the scale of everything else that was happening, but I remember sitting on Denise's couch and just crying, actually crying, for the first time since the fire, because someone in my family, extended, distant, barely present for a decade, had asked me a direct, practical question about my safety and my needs without a single caveat attached to it. No, not our problem. No lecture about renter's insurance. No conditional love wrapped around an obligation I hadn't asked her to fulfill. Just, do you need money? Don't be polite about it. She sent money anyway, a few weeks later, unprompted, with a note that said for the pan, or whatever else, love R, which is how months later, I ended up crying again in a kitchen supply store over a cast iron skillet, for reasons the cashier very kindly did not ask me to explain. Rosalind has become, since then, the closest thing I have to a present, functional maternal relationship, which is a strange sentence to write about your aunt rather than your mother. But I've stopped being precious about where support comes from as long as it actually arrives. She testified, eventually, as a character witness, not for Callie, but for me, in a separate civil matter I pursued against my mother regarding the guest room arrangement and what she may have known, a case that ultimately settled quietly and modestly. More as an acknowledgement than a financial windfall, but an acknowledgement I needed on the record regardless of what it was worth in dollars. Rosalind sat in that deposition room and told the truth about 30 years of watching her sister-in-law build an entire family structure around protecting one daughter at the expense of the other, and she did it without flinching, without softening it for anyone's comfort, in a way that made me understand, for the first time, what Eleanor must have sounded like when she was younger. I think that's part of what this story is actually about, underneath the fire and the ring and the arrest. It's about learning that family isn't the four walls you were born inside of. It's the people who show up, consistently, in the specific unglamorous ways that matter, the 4-hour drives, the money sent without conditions, the willingness to tell an uncomfortable truth under oath, because it's true, not because it's easy. Some of those people share your blood. Plenty of them don't. I've stopped assuming the overlap between family and the people obligated to love me is as large as I was raised to believe it was. It's been 14 months now. I have a new apartment, a new couch that is entirely, boringly mine, and a fire extinguisher mounted by my kitchen door that I check the pressure gauge on more often than is probably necessary. A habit my therapist says is reasonable given everything and that I should let myself keep for as long as it helps. Denise and I are closer than ever she's become, in the vocabulary my therapist introduced me to, part of my chosen family, a phrase that used to sound like a consolation prize to me and now sounds like the whole point. My father and I have a careful, limited relationship, built mostly around brief, cordial texts and the occasional lunch where we don't discuss my mother or Callie at all, an unspoken agreement that lets us have something rather than nothing. My mother and I have almost nothing, and I've stopped grieving that almost nothing the way I used to, because grieving it required believing there was once a something worth returning to, and I've done enough documentation, in the end, on my own family, to know that isn't true. I still work hospice. I still sit with the dying and watch, over and over, the same truth confirm itself, that love, in the end, is a behavior and not a feeling, a thing people do consistently over years, not a thing they claim loudly while doing the opposite. I still write things down. I probably always will. If you're the strong one in your family, if you've spent years being told that's a compliment while watching someone else get all the softness, all the second chances, all the benefit of the doubt, I hope you hear this clearly. You are allowed to stop proving it. You are allowed to write things down and trust what the record shows you, even when it's about people who share your blood. You are allowed to let a boundary be the whole sentence, without an apology tacked onto the end of it. Not our problem, my mother said, at 5 a.m, while my life burned down 2 blocks away. She was more right than she knew. It was never our problem. It was hers. It just took a fire, an arson report, and a sapphire ring on a kitchen floor to finally prove it.